Hello world and welcome back to Money Makes Games. Today I just want to show you a quick way to change your game into a local multiplayer game. Ready to do this? Then follow me. Okay, now to demonstrate this to you, I'm going to use a little Pong game that I've set up. I'll be creating a series on how to do this for beginners. So if you don't want to miss that, then that's right, subscribing really helps me. Enough with the marketing though, let's get going. Now the secret to local multiplayer is the Unity Player Input Manager, which is part of the new player input system. So I've set up a game object, which I've called Input Manager, and I've added the component, which is the Player Input Manager. So you go add component, Player Input Manager, and you're there. Now to set up the Player Input Manager, there's a few things we want to do. Firstly, the Player Input Manager has a notification behavior. That means that when a player joins, it sends out a notification via a Unity event or a broadcast or a message. I prefer the Unity event, so I've set that up. It's got two events that get triggered. One is for when a player joins and one is for when a player leaves. The event passes a player input object to whichever function is called. Now in this case, I've got my game manager and I've got a function called player joined, which accepts a player input as a parameter. After events, we go down and we look at joining. Now, joining behavior you can set up several different ways. You can have join players when join action is triggered, if you set up a join action in your player input, or join players manually. We won't be covering that because today we'll just use join players when button is pressed. In other words, if a button is pressed on the controller that is set up, a player will join. So if I have two game controllers connected to my computer and I press a button on one of them, then one player will join, and if I press a button on the other one, another player will join. For today's demo, I've set up my keyboard and my game controller as controllers. Then we have a field here for our player prefab. Now this is important. I've got my player prefab set up here. This is very easy. It's got a player input, which you need to move it, and then I've got a little player script here which just dictates the behavior of my player, not relevant for what we want to do today. And then it's got the colliders and so on to make it work. Right, now back to our input manager. The player prefab is going to get spawned when the player joins, and it will get spawned by the player input manager, which will let us know via these events. Then we just say joining enabled by default, because we want the player to join by default, and limit the number of players. Now I've made this 2 because I'm creating a Pong game, and having 40 players in front of one computer playing Pong might not be practical. Then down here there's something called split screen. Now, I'm sure you've played games like Mario Kart or so where you have a split screen mode. This basically just makes that easy to set up. The only thing here is that if you want a split screen, then your player prefab needs its own point of view camera attached to it. If you do that, you can enable split screen. There's some things you can set up like maintain aspect ratio to ensure that when it splits the screen, it actually maintains the aspect ratio of the original screen. And then there's set fixed number, which is basically it can split your screen up into, say, 4 screens, even if you only have 3 players. So you'll have one screen that basically doesn't show anything, but you'll have 3 player screens. And then you've got your screen rectangle size, which you can set. I'm not going to go into that too much today, because what we want to do is just set up this simple multiplayer right now. Okay, we've got the player input manager covered. So let's look at our game manager script. The game manager script basically just has a number for max players. It has player start positions, which is 2 transforms that I have here. Those are the positions with the correct rotations for my players to spawn at. And then I've got a ball prefab that will basically just get spawned when the game starts. Alright, most of this is irrelevant to what I want to show you, so I won't go into it too much. Now, when the player join event is triggered, in other words, when a player presses a button on a controller in this case, our player input's going to call player joined. Now, player joined passes this player input object to us, and then we go if players equals null. That means that our array of players that I've declared way up here is null. In other words, it doesn't exist yet. Then we just create a new array, and we create the size of that to match max players, which is 2 in this case. Then I take the input.player index, which is basically the input of the player, the index of the player that has just joined. So when the first player joins, the input.player index will be 0. When the second player joins, it will be 1, and then 2, 3, 4, and so forth. We set our index to that, and then we grab the game object that was spawned as well. So again, from this player input, we say input.gameObject, and that's going to return the player object that was just spawned. Then on that object, we set our player index or players. We set the game object to that specific index. So because it's our first player, that's going to be player index 0. We grab the player component for it. We add it to our array. Now I've done this because I want to use the player later on in the game. And then we also grab that player and we set the transform and rotation for it to the positions that we want. And then lastly, we just check if the index equals max players minus 1. In other words, if our index equals 1, which means we have 2 players on screen, then we start our game. All right, let's look at this in action. Okay, game started. I press the arrow button on my keyboard. My first player has spawned and I can control him. Then I press a button on my game controller. Second player has spawned, and yes, I'm not very good at playing 2 sides at once, but at least we know it works. That's it. Thank you for watching. My name is Mani and I make games.